At the very heart of what you do, at the very, very heart, if I looked at all that you've produced and I had to encapsulate it into just one or two sentences that encapsulates your mission statement, what would that be?
I want to share the beauty and utility of biology. I want people to understand how incredible the human body and brain are, and how even a small understanding of the underlying mechanisms about how we interact with light or temperature, exercise, thoughts, emotions, etc., how that can impact our health in really powerful ways.
You have become a cultural phenomenon because of the information that you've shared. In your view, why and how has that happened? I guess maybe most importantly, why has that happened? What is it that you've kind of catered to that was absent in people's understanding of themselves?
Well, I think people are intensely curious about themselves, meaning our species, why we feel the way we feel, why other people feel and act the way they do. And I think most everybody, I like to think, is deeply interested in how to be the best version of themselves. And I think what I've done is I've provided a lens into all of that through biology, through neuroscience in particular, but also I'm a practitioner. So since I was pretty young, I've been actively involved in sports and psychology and interested in what one can do, in some cases take, things to avoid in order to be the best version of oneself. And so I'm an academic, right? I have a laboratory and I'm a tenured faculty member at Stanford, although I should mention that I've shrunk my laboratory considerably in the last year or so. But I've done experiments on animal models, on humans and human clinical trials. So I have the understanding and expertise of a research scientist. And at the same time, I think very deeply about how to translate the information in these peer-reviewed papers, how to translate the information in the fields of science and medicine into actionable, what we call protocols. And I do my best to distill things down into, actionable things. But I'm not a big believer in dumbing things down. I decided to go the opposite way. Rather than give little snippets, 90-second videos, we include those, but rather I decided to go for full 1 to 3 hour, maybe even 4-hour lectures on a topic, because I believe, and I'm not the first to say it, that people have near infinite ability to learn if they are told things in a way that's clear. So I believe that people want to understand, they can understand, and it doesn't require decorating things in a lot of complicated language. Sometimes we need to include some complicated language just because that's the way science and medicine are, and that people are willing to learn that and carry that along. And once they understand how they work a little bit better, you arm them with a little bit of knowledge, then really they're just off to the races and the rest takes care of itself. And so I was also exposed to this incredible world of DIY, like take your passion, take your circumstance, and pick a craft and just document stuff. And so in many ways, like what happened at Embarcadero and what happened in skateboarding, and I always loved punk rock music and going to shows. I have no musical talent and I didn't suck at skateboarding, but I wasn't gonna go anywhere with it. But what I saw was if you love something and you wanna learn as much as possible about it and you love the culture around it, you do have to learn how to sort out the untoward elements. Don't get yourself into trouble. But you take that energy, and I just took it to academics. I remember realizing when I got to graduate school, I found a wonderful lab to work in with a wonderful woman named Barbara Chapman. Unfortunately, she passed away. And at the time she said, listen, I'm gonna have a couple kids, but we have grants, you can, so she said, I'm gonna have a couple kids, so I'm gonna be very busy, but we have grants and here's the lab. She said, don't burn the lab down, don't hurt yourself, but just do experiments, have fun. And I realized, I was like, this is the best. And I had so much energy and I thought, I never have to go home. So I lived there a lot of the time, brush my teeth in the sink there, work out at the gym, shower, come back. And I remember people saying, you're gonna burn out. What are you doing? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I would work 80, sometimes 100 hours a week. I was so happy. And I realized like, this is the exact same feeling. I'm just taking my interest and I'm just pouring myself into it. I did that when I was a graduate student. I did it when I was a postdoc. And actually when I was a postdoc, I started writing some music articles for Thrasher magazine. I've always kept some little tie to the skateboarding industry that way, just to make some extra cash. And then when I was a junior professor, I had to really pour myself just into the laboratory, but it still worked out. And I guess the point is that earlier you and I were talking about if you have, and I'm borrowing this phrase from one of my heroes, Martha Beck, who's a wonderful person and teacher, such wisdom, and she calls it a interest-based attention system. Some people might call it ADHD, but have you ever noticed that even people, and we know this from the scientific literature, people, kids, adults with ADHD, when they're in so-called ADHD, when they are doing something they really love, they're like a laser. They're not going to peel off that. Their attention is like level 11 out of 10. So I took that energy that I've always had in me for fish, for tropical birds, skateboarding, punk rock music, eventually it was biology. And I just went, okay, here are my chips. I'm all in. But the goal has always been and remains to take what I learn and share it. Because the real joy in doing anything, for me anyway, is the ability to share in that knowledge or in that experience. And so those early years were really choppy and really dangerous, frankly. But then when I started a laboratory and decided, hey, I'm going to study human stress, let's go get VR of stressful circumstances. And my friend Michael Muller, who's a very accomplished portrait photographer in Hollywood and also takes photos of great white sharks out of cages, he said to me, oh, your VR stimulus in your lab, here's what he told me. He's like, it sucks. He said, it sucks. It doesn't look real. It's all CGI. It's not scary at all. How about we, go film some great white sharks down in Guadalupe Island and we leave the cage? And, the young Andrew was like, okay. So got dive certified, went and did it 1 year, stayed in the cage, went the next year, exited the cage. I'm not recommending people live this way. I'm not, because I had an air failure at depth the second year while I was in the cage. I bailed out, I made it, I lived, but it was super scary. And it was not an experience I want to repeat. And I realized, that's the line. Like the great Oliver Sacks, another hero of mine, British trained neurologist and author, he wrote, was basically what became the script for Awakenings and things like that. There's a quote about him that resonates a lot. And the quote, I think, is, an early teacher of his said, Oliver will go far, provided he does not go too far. And so, you have to be careful, right? These adventures, leaving school, you can't be haphazard about it. So if you look at the broad arc, it's highly nonlinear, but there's a common thread through all of it, which is this desire to learn, curiosity, desire to share, intensity. And when I'm involved in any one thing, and I recommend that if people are involved in any one thing, if it's podcasting or sport or video games or math or AI or program, whatever it is, skateboarding, whatever it is, that you can't be haphazard in that world, because forward progress, even if you change things over time, is the consequence of taking that inherent uniqueness that we each have and whatever level of intensity we have, and making sure that you do take steps forward. And what I've learned is, as a child, as an adolescent, and as an adult, there are all these traps along the way. There are all these chutes down to failure and destruction, and you have to be very, very thoughtful. And so you can't be reckless.
I'm so intrigued by that, because in that moment you have, I think, a moment in which a lot of people are searching for in their lives, where you have a decision to do it differently. And I've always wondered what it takes for someone to get there. And is it something that you can accelerate towards? Like, if I'm laying on the couch right now and I'm feeling that, is there something I can do to get me there, or do I need more pain?
Fear. I'll tell you, super scary being like almost 19 years old, girlfriend left me. I'm not good at anything. I wasn't good at anything. Not skateboarding, couldn't play an instrument. Everyone in that town surfed.
Family.
I mean, I could have gone to the fire service, and that's a wonderful career path. I didn't have any marketable skills. I couldn't really do anything, except I knew my capacity to learn. I've always had a very good memory, and I've always enjoyed learning. So I thought, okay, school seems like a good option. They tell you what you need to know. In fact, at one point I realized, and I think it was Ryan Holiday that said that, the people who should absolutely not drop out of college are the people who are not doing well, because the real world is a lot harder in many ways. It's a lot harder than college. In college, they tell you what to do. I remember taking a class in Greek mythology. You go there, if you sit near the front, you pay attention, you try not to pay attention to anyone else, you sit down, they tell you what you need to know. Now, sometimes it's complicated, you can't keep up, but then they have these things called office hours where you can ask, they have teaching assistants. I mean, the whole thing is set up so that you almost can't fail if you do the required steps. Whereas with skateboarding, it's like I was always getting broke off, as they say. You know, I was always rolling my left foot, snapped again, nothing, couldn't do it. And there's so much uncertainty in other things. At least with a college education, for me, it was like, okay, I can learn this stuff. And then what I found is when there's a desire to learn, and then you learn, and then you do well, and I started doing very well. But there's that one class that I got a B+ in that I'm still pissed off about. You know, my first year was a disaster. Then it was all A's, and then there's this one class in neural development from Ben Reese, and I got a B+. And as a consequence, when I went to graduate school, I studied neural development. You know, it's the thing that you don't get, the place where you make an error that you forever carry that signal. I need to get better at that. So I think a lot of it is just having the knowledge of self, right? What did the Oracle say? Know thyself. The knowledge of self to really think, okay, well, like, what are my strengths? Do I like to learn if I'm interested in something? Do I have a voracious appetite? Maybe if you're a person with less energy, maybe you're more reflective, or you like to journal, or you need more time to process. I think turning what often appear as weaknesses into strengths is really possible. And then I do think that we are all each endowed with some unique gift. I really believe in this. It's not mystical for me. I think that we all have some wiring of our brains that's very similar, and we all have some unique wiring based on our genetics and our experience. And I just thought, I'm going to keep paying attention to what fills my body with energy.
The other thing that I'm curious about as it relates to dopamine is pornography. I think pornography has become more readily available now than ever before.
Certainly.
I can go on any social media platform, especially X, and I scroll down for long enough, I will be exposed to pornography, whether I chose to go and seek it out or not.
Yeah, it'll find you.
It'll find you on pretty much every application. So it's especially concerning for young people who are in those formative years. But what is your view on pornography, dopamine, and the overall social harm of pornography?
Yeah, so this is a controversial topic because obviously people have different opinions on limiting personal freedom, right? Both expression and consumption of pornography, right? But moving that aside and just focusing on things through the lens of biology and the dopamine system, we know that the more stimulating, the more intense an experience, the greater the increase in dopamine. I mean, it's very clear based on neuroimaging studies that, you know, more amphetamine causes bigger increases in dopamine than less amphetamine. More cocaine causes bigger increases in dopamine than less cocaine. Caffeine can cause an increase in dopamine, but it's not nearly the kind of increase, the peak that is, that you observe with amphetamine or cocaine, all right? So we can't just say stimulants, and we can't just say sex. We can't just say pornography. We have to ask within the domain of pornography, because we know that sexual activity, and in particular anticipation of sexual activity, okay, this is important. Anticipation of sexual activity raises dopamine levels. Then the question is, what is the range of things and the range of dopamine increase? Now, while there hasn't been a very systematic exploration of this, we know that, you know, a lot of pornography is extreme, right? It involves more than two people. It can involve all sorts of dynamics that for some people are going to be hyperstimulatory, okay? So this is very different than, I guess, what people would call soft pornography, quote unquote, right? And here, these are subjective labels. Mm-hmm. So let's just pick a hypothetical scenario. A person is viewing a lot of, let's say, high intensity, high dopamine for them, releasing pornography. Okay, for some people that might be pornography of genre A. For other people, it might be pornography of genre B. For somebody who never looks at pornography, maybe it's quite mild, But for them, it's actually quite intense in terms of the amount of dopamine it releases. Now, what do we know based on dopamine dynamics? Remember, dopamine is the universal currency of motivation, seeking, and reward. It's not like there's dopamine unique to pornography versus dopamine unique to food. It's just a matter of levels and duration. If somebody is consuming, let's call it very intense, AKA high dopamine releasing pornography on a regular basis, what do we know? That peak in dopamine will start to lessen. It'll be lower and lower. And the trough in dopamine after they view that pornography will be deeper trough and longer trough, meaning they are very likely, we don't know for sure, but very likely to seek out more and more intense experiences to try and just get them back to baseline. Pretty soon, the pornography that at one time was very stimulating for them is no longer stimulating. Now, the concern here is that, and let's just be frank, we're not just talking about viewing pornography. We also have to ask ourselves, what are people doing as they view this pornography? This is a conversation that should be had, but I have to do it in a way where I'm not imparting moral judgment on any of it. I'm not saying people should masturbate or not masturbate. That's none of my business, frankly. This is highly individual. It relates to all sorts of things in terms of values, et cetera. The point is, however, that we know that orgasm is a dopamine-related event, and post-orgasm, there's an increase in a molecule called prolactin in the brain. Prolactin actually, in part, sets the refractory period in which there can't be further erection in males and orgasm in males. Okay, and in females, it really depends. I mean, there's this whole world. I mean, Dr. Rina Malik is far more skilled to discuss this than I am about, different types of orgasms in women, et cetera, the extent to which multiple orgasms can occur in some individuals, not others. I think the general belief is that it's possible in most anybody, including males and females, right? But that it's more typical in females than in males, this sort of thing. Here's the point. Dopamine and prolactin generally are in a kind of a push-pull or seesaw relationship, whereby very stimulatory, high dopamine releasing activities and pornography and things like that increase dopamine, but repeated exposure to that, regardless of the activities occurring during that time, lead to big, long troughs in dopamine, such that more stimulation is required just to get any sense of arousal. We also know that prolactin, when that is increased, tends to create a kind of subdued lack of dopamine. I'm using these terms broadly, kind of amotivated, non-motivated state. There are reasons for this biologically, right? After ejaculation, the idea is that animals won't then, or humans won't then copulate again and again and again, at least not for some period of time. The duration of the refractory period is highly individual. It's determined by age, by species. There's the so-called Coolidge effect. Are you familiar with the Coolidge effect?
I'm familiar with post-nut clarity.
Okay, slightly different. There's an anecdote that, at least to my understanding, is true. At least the Coolidge effect is a known thing in neuroendocrinology, whereby President Calvin Coolidge, reportedly, was visiting a chicken farm with his wife. They were touring the farm, and there were a lot of hens and a lot of chickens generally. And the docent who was showing them around said, this rooster here, pointed to a rooster, copulates more than 300 times per day. It's remarkable. And Mrs. Coolidge turns to President Coolidge and says, you hear that? 300 times per day. She's obviously quite impressed and letting him know that. And Coolidge, that is President Coolidge, says, but let me ask you a question. Same hen or different hens? And the docent says, different hens. Now, here's the phenomenon, the Coolidge effect. It exists in rodents. It exists in chickens. It exists in dogs. People can speculate whether or not it exists in humans, whereby if an animal copulates, then the male is in a refractory period lasting anywhere from minutes to hours to days, depending on age, species, et cetera. During that refractory period, they can't achieve erection and or ejaculate again. But if you replace the mate with a novel mate, the refractory period is shortened substantially. Why? The answer is very clear based on actual measurements of brain dopamine. Why? Because dopamine is also associated with novelty. Now, the refractory period probably serves an important evolutionary role whereby it improves pair bonding so that post post-ejaculation, post-orgasm. Okay, here I'm interchangeably talking about these for males and females. Anytime you hear ejaculation, then people think males, etc. Post-orgasm, post-coital bliss, pair bonding, the sharing of pheromones, the sharing of stories, the sharing of affection, right? The sharing of a bed to sleep in. These things are intimately involved in pair bonding. So I'm not saying that the refractory period is a bad thing. What I'm saying is that dopamine can overcome the refractory period, but the refractory period itself is largely due to an increase in prolactin that suppresses dopamine. So let's go back all the way to this question about pornography. What's the typical scenario? Well, this is not something I choose to think about a lot. You're talking about some individual in their apartment or home watching intense dopamine stimulating pornography in which they presumably are aroused or not aroused. They do or don't do whatever they choose to do, but that over time has less and less of an effect in getting them aroused. And keep in mind that none of this necessarily translates to real world human safe interactions between individuals, right? Pornography is very, very different than real world sexual interactions. So there is a phenomenon that is starting to surface on the internet. What do I mean by that? I mean, there are a lot of questions posed in podcast forums, meaning in the comment section on YouTube, about, is pornography dangerous? Is it bad, et cetera? I think the thing that we can say for sure is that any behavior, any substance that stimulates a lot of dopamine and that is easily accessed without effort is potentially problematic.